A basic collar with a stand has three parts. First, there's the stand, which attaches the collar to the rest of the shirt. Then there's the under collar, which is the part that's hidden when you're wearing the collar, and then there's the over collar. A very intuitive way to draft the stand for the collar is to take a band that's a little bit longer than your neck is around, than your neck's diameter, and wrap it around your neck. This band is cut on the grain and it's straight. Once it feels comfortable and is sitting how you want the band for your collar to sit, pin it in the center. Then mark the exact center of the band and curve the front of the band so that it forms a smooth curve with the rest of the band. Then I'm just pinning it exactly in the center, folding back the top band, and then marking the center on the other side. And then lastly, I'm just marking where I want the side seam of the shirt to be. If you already had the rest of a shirt drafted, then you would put that shirt on while you're drafting the band. With the band removed, I'm matching the two markings for the center and pinning them together so that I can fold my band in half. And that's going to let me find what the center back of the band is. And then I'm just creasing the center back with my finger to mark it. And cutting along the curve that I drew. This last bit you could have done probably while wearing the band, but I think it's better to do it on the tracing paper that you're going to make your pattern out of. So first I'm transferring the markings that I put onto the band onto the tracing paper, and I'm only tracing half of the band, so from center back to center front. So the thing I just marked, that's the center front of the band. This is the center front of the band. And then I'm marking along the center front the same width as at the center back and at the side seam and throughout the band, so that the band is the same width throughout. And I'm just adding 1 inch to the band, or I guess I should call it stand. This is based on personal preference, and I actually later on decided to make it closer to a 1/2 inch, and this is just how the two sides will overlap when it's worn. And here I'm just curving the top of the band so that it's the same throughout, width-wise. And as I said, I think that this added 1 inch is a little wide. If you look at a lot of button-downs, which have stand collars, or at least the button-downs I have, most of the overlap seems to be closer to a 1/2 inch. Then I'm just curving the overlapped part. And that's also a design element. You could curve it more, you could curve it less, you could make it a different shape, like a triangle if you wanted, or whatever you want. But this is just sort of what shows up in a lot of stand collars. And make sure the two curves on the top and on the bottom of the stand are symmetrical. Sorry, not symmetrical, parallel. And that's what 1/2 of the stand for a collar with a stand looks like. You cut this along the fold of the fabric on the grain. And to make a full collar, you should cut 2 and also cut 1 out of interfacing. I should note that these pattern pieces I'm making don't have any seam allowance, so when you're actually sewing the pattern, you need to add seam allowance. And here I'm just marking out a buttonhole which goes 1/8 inch past center front. A second way to make the stand is entirely through measurements. So first measure how big around your neck is, and then also where you want the side seam to go. On a piece of tracing paper or just paper or pattern paper, mark out half of the diameter of your neck. So my neck is 12 inches around, so this is 6 inches. And then mark how tall you want the stand of your collar to be. I'm making it 1¼ inches, but this is entirely dependent on the design of the collar you're making. So it could be a lot taller, it could be narrower. I think 1 to 1¼ even 1½ inch sometimes is pretty normal for a stand. Mark out where you want your side seam to go. And as you can see, it's the same as the other stand I drafted through draping. Again, the stand should be the same width throughout. Mark 1/2 inch above the initial line you drew, and curve that into the side seam. For any of these curves, you could and really should use a French curve as a guide instead of freehanding it like what I'm doing. Then I'm marking the stand height above my new curve, so 1¼ inches above the curved line I just drew. And so all those lines should be the same width, the back, the side seam, and the center front lines. And then, like before, I'm marking 1 inch beyond the center front for the overlap of the two sides. And as I said before, I ended up changing this to closer to 1/2 inch later. And this added width is entirely, it's up to you how wide you want it. And kind of up to, like, if you have a placket below this for the front of the shirt, then it's kind of dependent on how wide you want that placket to be. And then I'm curving the front again, or the top. And then in the center of the center front, I'm just marking a buttonhole. As you can see, the draped and the drafted stands are quite similar. The only difference is that there is a different angle at the bottom, which is probably just because my neck is somehow not an average shape. And as the power of drafting the pattern through draping it on your neck instead of just through relying on a formula. In order to draft the collar part of this collar with a stand, I'm first tracing the curve of the stand, and I'm using the draped stand, not the other stand that was based on a formula. I'm tracing also the center back, and to that I'm adding 1/2 inch. at the center front, I'm measuring 1/2 inch in from the center front mark. And then I'm drawing a line for the point of the collar, which is 1 inch longer than the back. That's entirely up to like what you want the front collar to look like, and I end up changing it and shortening it afterwards. On the other hand, the back of the collar, it's very important to keep it at 1/2 inch longer than the stand. So here I'm just comparing it to a collar that I have that I like. As you can see, the back is roughly 1/2 inch longer than the stand, but the front is a lot shorter, and so then I decided to shorten the collar because I know that I like this shorter collar already. I think later I end up adding like 1/4 or 1/2 inch to the collar point. So it's just a matter of deciding what you want. Then I'm marking out where the side seam will go, which is a marking that's useful to transfer to the fabric you're using in the end. And then I'm marking halfway in between the front and the side seam, and between the back and the side seam. And drawing a straight line at both those points. And that just stands for center back and center front. And as I said, I just added like a small amount to the collar because I decided I wanted it to be just a bit longer. Then I'm cutting along those 2 lines that I just drew, and I'm trying not to cut the very top so that all of the pattern is still connected, but just by a very small piece of tracing paper. At both these points, I'm spreading the collar out by 1/8 of an inch, and the reason you need to do that is to give the collar space to fit over the stand. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a collar that's exactly the size of the stand in some parts and won't really be able to comfortably sit over top of the stand and look good. And this also helps the collar from riding up in the back. I don't know if you've ever had a collar that just won't stay down in the back, but this helps with that. And then I'm just tracing the final collar. And like the stand, the collar is cut on the grain and on the fold. The last piece of the collar to draft is the undercollar, which is very similar to the overcollar or the collar, and actually can be exactly the same if you want it to be. But doing just one minor adjustment to it helps it fit a lot better. So at the center back, just lower the mark by 1/8 of an inch, and then everything else keeps the same. And what this does is it means that the pattern for the undercollar is just a bit smaller than the rest of the collar, and so it makes it easier for the collar to stay down instead of flipping up. If you use pattern pieces for the collar and undercollar that are exactly the same, then the collar is more likely to fit up and doesn't flip up, and just doesn't fit as nice. The undercollar can be cut on the fold and on the grain like the rest, but you can also cut it on the bias, like that. That's what the diagonal line means. And again, it just makes it fit a bit better. The bias has a different stretch than the grain, and the undercollar being on the bias and then seamed down the center works well. In order to test the fit of the collar, I've just cut out the top collar piece with seam allowance only along its top edge, and I've cut out the stand without any seam allowance at all. And at this point, I decided I wanted the stand to have a little less overlap. So that's what I'm doing here, and again, that's entirely just personal preference. Then I'm just creasing the collar along the seam allowance so that I have it marked when I'm pinning it to the stand. You could use an iron for this, but in a lot of fabric, fingers are just fine. And then as you can see, the collar is just going to fold over the stand in this mock-up. I've creased the center back of both the collar and the stand in order to have the center backs of both line up. and then I'm just pinning them together so that the edge of the stand is against the crease of the collar. If you're finding it hard to get the two to line up, you could try stay stitching the stand. And there I've just stitched the stand onto the collar with 2 lines of stitching. And I'm just creasing it by hand. And then you can use this to assess the fit, line up the center front on both sides of the stand, pin it to your neck, and check if there's any wrinkling or if the collar goes too long anywhere or anything like that.